Hey, this is lesson 3 of World War I. Today we're going to focus mostly on trench warfare. We will also talk about the Schlieffen Plan and the beginning of the war, as well as life in the trenches for the soldiers. So let's review real quickly. We have the World War I alliances. You have the Central Powers led by Germany, with their main ally being Austria-Hungary. You also have Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire on the side of the Central Powers. For the Allies, the three main powers at the beginning of the war were Britain, France, and Russia. Later on in the war, Russia is going to leave. In 1917, and the United States will join, so you have your major powers as Britain, France, and the United States. You also have Italy, Belgium, Japan, Serbia, and several other countries on the side of the Allies. So for the Central Powers, you have Germany. Germany is the strongest army in the world during World War I, and it has by far the strongest member of the Central Powers. So most of the fighting for the Central Powers is going to involve Germany in one way or the other. Germany had to fight against many enemies at the same time, including France and Russia. Britain will join, they'll have to fight against them, they'll have to fight against the United States when they join, they'll have to send help to Austria and your other countries on their side as well to keep them into the war numerous times. Fighting against France and Russia at the same time was difficult because it posed a problem of having two fronts. You had to fight against Russia over here on the right of the map and France over here toward the left of the map. Fighting in Russia along the Russian border was called the Eastern Front, and fighting along the French border was called the Western Front. So Germany wanted a way to avoid fighting a two-front war, so they came up with something called the Schlieffen Plan. And this would be to quickly defeat France before moving over and attacking and defeating Russia. So the Schlieffen Plan had four major assumptions. Number one, said Russia would take 6 weeks to mobilize. It said, number two, France would easily be defeated in 6 weeks. Three, Belgium would not resist a German attack. And number four, Britain would remain neutral. Now, all four of these assumptions are false. Russia took only 10 days to mobilize. France was not defeated at all during World War I. Belgium did resist the German attack, and some points pushed them back decent, although they would not hold up. And when Germany did invade Belgium, Britain did not remain neutral. They joined the war to protect Belgium on the side of the Allies. So Germany begins the war by invading Belgium en route to France. This causes Britain to join the war against Germany. Britain pledged to protect Belgium, so they declare war on Germany and join France along the Western Front. Despite this, Germany moved quickly into France and towards the capital of France, Paris. One major reason for this is France put a lot of their troops along the German-French border, and when Germany invaded through Belgium instead, they met less resistance. It seemed like the war on the Western Front might end fairly quickly. However, as we said, Russia mobilized much quicker than expected. They forced Germany to divide their troops between the Western Front and the Eastern Front when Russia attacks Germany early on in the war in 1914. Now, Germany opens up and starts fighting a two-front war, fighting against France and Russia at the same time, or fighting in France and in Russia at the same time. However, Russia was not a very strong power at this point. Germany was much more powerful than them, so they could focus some of their attention on the Western Front. However, Russia had the largest army in the world during World War I. Not necessarily the strongest, but the largest. So even though Russia was struggling and losing most of these battles fairly severely, they could easily recruit more and more soldiers and send to the front lines, which kept Germany occupied throughout almost the whole war. So while Germany sent troops to the Eastern Front, France and Britain were able to regroup on the Western Front and launch a counterattack against Germany. And at the Battle of Marne, France and Britain stopped the German advance, actually pushed them back closer into Germany, and hopes for a short war ended because both sides dug trenches. And trenches are these long, narrow ditches dug in the ground where soldiers lived. And this is the way things remained for most of World War I on the Western Front. The trenches made it very difficult to take over your enemy because they were protected by the ground, and it was very difficult to gain ground with the machine guns and all the other defensive weapons that were very advanced at this time. So here you see a diagram of a trench. Here is what you call no man's land. That's the area between your trenches and your enemy's trench. You have different levels of trenches. Here you have the front line trench, you have the support trench behind that, and you have the reserve trench toward the back. Connecting these, you have what you call communication trenches. And then underneath the trenches, you have underground dugouts, which are supposed to protect the soldiers from an attack, allow them to rest, and allow the officers to meet. So as we said earlier, this over here is no man's land. And the soldiers would go over the top of the trenches through the barbed wire and toward their enemy across no man's land. The barbed wire was there to protect you from an enemy attack. If the enemies got close, they would have to navigate through the barbed wire entanglements, which would lead them to machine gun fire and really slow up their advance, allow the people to fire on the attacking soldiers. So machine guns were very important. You also had to worry about landmines that were set up by the enemy to stop your advance and cause an explosion. You have artillery at the back of the trenches that were used before an attack. These could launch several miles, and you have air support as well. You have the trench diagram here that shows no man's land would be up at the top here. And then you have barbed wire entanglements in front of your trenches. You have a parapet at the top where you would go over the top here and toward your enemies. You have a fire step, which you can step on to fire and keep your head below ground when you're walking on a normal level. You had boardwalks, or they called them duck boards, that I put up to prevent the water from getting your feet wet and everything else that comes with that. And we'll talk more about the problems of wet feet and mud and everything later on. And then lastly, you have dugouts behind them. Sometimes you would have wooden boards and so forth to protect your trench from falling down. Some trenches are very well developed. Some trenches were very basic. Really depended on how long that trench existed and how much action was going on in that area. So the use of trench warfare turned World War I from into a stalemate. On the Western Front, neither side could gain much ground against the enemy. This is largely because you're protected by the trenches, and also you have the defensive weapons such as a machine gun, which are much more advanced in attack strategies. Charging at the enemy and charging directly into machine gun fire was not very successful. Capturing ground was not very common in World War I, especially until the very end on the Western Front. So it became a war of attrition where both sides tried to wear down an enemy to the point of total collapse, hoping that there'd be a revolution or they'd run out of food or supplies. Basically, you're playing till your enemy gives up, or fighting till your enemy gives up, similar to like a game of Bloody Knuckles or something like that. So in an attempt to break the stalemate, officers would command their soldiers to go over the top, and as we said, this would be going out of their trenches and charging toward the enemy's trench. Most of these were very, very unsuccessful. Rarely was it successful for a soldier to navigate through all the problems. You have poisonous gas, you have landmines, you have barbed wire, you have snipers, you have machine guns, you have the barbed wire entanglements, the mud, and everything else that would prevent these charges from being successful. Trench warfare and advancements in weaponry such as landmines, barbed wire, all these things we talked about made advancement and attacks very unsuccessful and extremely difficult. So the stalemate is going to continue on for years, and they're going to find new ways to try to attack your enemies. They have flamethrowers, which would shoot fire at your enemies, could go for 10, 20 yards, but this was not real practical because you had to actually carry the gasoline and everything with you. If there was wind, it would blow it back in your face, and you were obviously a target for snipers and usually wouldn't make it all the way trenches. Some more successful strategies were the aircrafts with the Zeppelins and airplanes. You have tanks, which are very early models of tanks, but somewhat successful in World War I. And then you have artillery, which would be like highly advanced cannons and howitzers and mortars and many different types of artillery. So let's first talk about aircrafts. So you have a Zeppelin, as you can see in the picture here. This is a giant air blimp, and it would be used mostly for getting information about the enemy, but would also be used for bombing raids. And this was one of the early forms of aircraft. Now later on, you're going to have airplanes, and two of the main goals of airplanes or main purposes of airplanes were to protect the Zeppelins in a bombing raid or reconnaissance, and then also to protect your trench from being spied on. However, over time, this turned into actually air-to-air combat duels between airplanes. The story says it starts off with a guy throwing a brick at another airplane. Then you have throwing rope to try to get them their propeller blades tangled up. But eventually they end up strapping machine guns to the front of the airplane, and the pilot can shoot the machine gun as they fly the plane at the enemies or Zeppelins or even at the enemy's trenches. The main problem early on with the machine gun strapped to the front of the airplane was the fact that you could shoot your own propeller blades. But then they introduced the interrupting gear, which would actually time the propeller blade and a machine gun to make sure that you didn't hit yourself. Pilots during the World War I combat were very well known and became famous. The top pilots became known as aces, and the most famous pilot was a man who earned the nickname the Red Baron, who flew for Germany, and he accumulated many kills, but was eventually shot down, with his death being a little bit of a mystery, but they believe he may have been shot down actually from the enemy trenches. Here you see a lineup of World War I airplanes. These are German airplanes getting ready to take off, and you can tell they're German airplanes by the logo on the plane. You also have tanks. Tanks were introduced in 1916 at the Battle of Somme. Early on, the tanks weren't very successful. They got stuck. They could get blown up by artillery, but they did become more advanced as the war advanced. One of the main purposes of the tanks was to cross your enemy trenches. Also, it was kind of neat to have, or kind of important to have these actually escort your soldiers, your infantry, across no man's land and protect them from getting shot. So they were slow. They weren't real reliable, but they could run over barbed wire entanglements. They could even cross over trenches with their length and their treads. Okay, now you have artillery. Artillery such as the howitzers and mortars made a huge impact on World War I. Artillery was large caliber guns similar to cannons. During World War I, some of the artillery could fire over 6 miles. And you also had mortars, which we'll talk about real quickly here. So here is a howitzer. Actually, that's a mortar. Here you have a howitzer. This is the Big Bertha. This thing could shoot for several miles at your enemy, and you can see how high of a angle it could fire from. Okay. Then you have mortars. Mortars would be just a little kind of cylinder. You would drop the shell in and could shoot. This worked really well in trench warfare because you could fire almost straight up out of your trenches toward the enemy. Artillery was commonly used before an attack and to aid an attack. If you did not have artillery during attack, that attack usually ended up being highly unsuccessful. You have life in the trenches. One of the major problems for life in the trenches is disease and infestations. You had all these soldiers and bodies and human waste and garbage from the battlefield that was difficult to really remove. Some of this was sitting in no man's land. There's really nowhere to put a lot of these things, which led to bad sanitation. And then the dead bodies, the human waste, you have garbage. All this stuff also attracted rats. Rats could infest the battlefields and the trenches in the millions and could grow to be the size of house cats. And you can see this picture here of people who actually would hunt the rats in their location using pots and pans and bayonets and everything else. Lice also spread disease. They'd hatch eggs in the seams of your clothing. They would sometimes cause trench fever. You can see a picture of lice there. Obviously, they're not that big. They're very small. And they would get into your clothes and your hair and they'd hatch, and then they would bite, and this would cause trench fever. You have high fever, headaches, rash, inflamed eyes, leg pain, and if you got trench fever, you could be out for several months. And here's a picture of a lot of the different symptoms or signs of trench fever. Sanitation was poor, also contributed to disease. So not only do you have rats and lice and frogs and all these other things, you have body odor. Sometimes these soldiers would go days, weeks, even months without showering. You'd have garbage that they couldn't get rid of. As we said earlier, there was dead bodies you couldn't get rid of. All that leads to a very, very bad smell. And then also you have the latrines, which are the pit toilets, kind of porta potties that they have along the lines. There wasn't flushable toilets or any kind of plumbing that took place. So you would sit on these, in some cases, buckets, and these would be cleaned regularly, but not always. Sometimes the latrines were not very developed. This is a picture of them trying to show how nice the latrines actually were. Sometimes it was a matter of just like a bench over a hole, and then when you were done, you would just fill in the hole. Kind of actually, they had someone who actually clean this, and that was generally a form of punishment. Another problem common in trenches was trench foot. Trench foot was a fungal infection caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions. Trench foot often resulted in amputation, where they would actually have to cut out the foot. You can see them kind of inspecting and trying to keep their feet clean here. As drainage systems improved, as you have the boardwalks, trench foot became less common because you weren't walking in wet conditions all the time. Okay, I have some pictures here of trench foot that you can see. I do have the warning label up because some of these are fairly gross and gruesome, but I do have two pictures I'd like to show you what it would actually look like. Okay, so here's the first picture here. You can tell it looks a little bit like frostbite. If you look closely, you can see the toes have fallen off. You can see the toes have turned black and are kind of melted together. You also can see a heel bone and some other things in this picture. So it was quite graphic, quite painful, and like I said, often result in amputation. And here you can see another example of trench foot. The left foot seems a little bit worse than the right foot, but the right foot is pretty bad as well. So this was a major problem. Luckily, later on in the war, they started putting boardwalks across and really working on dry socks and dry feet to try to prevent this from becoming as big of a deal. So despite the protection provided by staying in the trenches, there was a lot of death that occurred in the trenches as well. Soldiers had to limit their movement during daylight hours because each side had snipers, and the snipers would kind of be hidden, looking at your enemy trench and looking for movement. And if you moved, a good skilled sniper could pick you off, shoot you in the head or wherever. So movement was very, very discouraged. Many men were shot on their first day of the trenches for attempting to peek over the parapet, which is kind of the top of the trench, and it was very, very dangerous. So during daylight hours, most people try to stay very still, very quiet to avoid being picked off by snipers. Most of the work was actually done at night, where it would be more difficult for the snipers to actually spot you. And in order to pass time, soldiers did a lot of different things. They played cards, they wrote letters home, they read letters from home, they took naps, they created trench art. All these different things helped them pass the time. And in some places in World War I, there wasn't a whole lot of action and it was kind of boring. Other times it was very intense. So it really depended on where you were at along the trenches and how aggressive your commanding officers were. During the night is when they did most of the works. You had to prepare for an enemy attack both at night and early in the morning, because many of them would come early in the morning. So some soldiers were responsible for patrolling no man's land. They were there to fix fence, prepare an enemy attack, spy on an enemy, and make sure that the enemy wasn't spying on you. Sometimes enemy patrol could find each other, and then that turned into an interesting situation. A lot of times they would fight using trench weapons such as brass knuckles or a trench knife to avoid being detected. And if there was noise, they could obviously just open fire on you. All right, so that's it for that lesson. Let me know if you have any questions. Look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for listening. Bye.